Hello, my name is Jada Hanby, and this is my co-host, Reverend David Clifford. Welcome back to this installment of the Monday Morning Preacher Podcast. We are so happy to have you joining us today if you are a new or returning member. If you have not already watched our last couple installments of this podcast, be sure to go check this out. The last one we did was super fun and exciting, so be sure to go check that out. You can find that on our YouTube channel where you are watching this one.
We're hoping they get better as we go.
Yes, we are hoping that they get better. That's for sure. Currently, we are still working on our recording space. As you notice, we are in a new space as of currently, and we're still working on the kinks and working all that out. We have some fun and exciting stuff planned, so be looking for that as it comes.
We're hoping to be in a more permanent location within the church that allows us to maintain our setup, to be able to adjust mics and lighting and
basically just leave our setup up continuously.
Right, make it easier on us and figure it out. Yeah.
Right. And hopefully next time we won't have just a plain wall.
Yeah, we've got some decorations we're working on.
Right.
As Jade and I were just talking about before we started filming, we got to figure out our table setup because we take notes and use notes, and that's not working. So we'll figure it out as we go.
Yeah, we thought this would work.
It'll keep changing.
Yeah. You'll see a bunch of different stuff in here. If you are new or returning, how our podcast normally works is that we ask some individuals in our church to respond to a question that we put in our monthly newsletter, The Spirit. And then what we do is we take those responses and read them and dive deeper into the topic and share a little bit of our personal experience, or we just dive deeper into this topic. So today we will be
let me note that our hope is to highlight one of the important parts of our church here at First Christian is that each individual kind of brings their own experiences to their own personal faith.
Right.
And then we try to build unity as a collective group. So you'll hear me talk a lot about the only requirement to join or to become a member of our church is to confess Jesus as Lord and Savior. So that's the only kind of doctrine or belief that we require our members to have. So there's a big diversity of beliefs in our church. So our hope with doing the podcast this way was to highlight some of our individual members and how they think about faith as it relates to certain topics. And then Jada and I, as she said,
because everyone views it differently, so we're trying to highlight that. Exactly. Today we're going to be talking about social justice. So David, if you want to take it away and start us off.
Yeah, so what I thought I'd do is give us kind of an overview about social justice from a faith perspective, and then we'll read our responses from the newsletter and kind of dive into it. So the first thing I want to highlight is that as many folks who read Scripture are aware of, justice is a big theme, especially in the Old Testament. God actually commands Abraham and his family to seek justice. And we really see this theme throughout the Scripture where they constantly fail at that, and they have to be reminded, hey, you're supposed to be seeking justice and doing these things as a community of faith. And my interpretation of what that means and how that works is that God was attempting to use Abraham and his family as a chosen people. We hear that, we see and read that in the Scriptures, to build a new community, a new world almost. And so justice is a key part of that piece. There's really two, from my understandings, there's two different ways to view justice as you think about it in the Old Testament and as you read about it. The first is retributive justice, and that means almost like what we think about when we think about the justice system in our community, right? Every action I do has a consequence. So if I break some law, there's a understanding of the type of justice that needs to be served because of that. It's more of an individual kind of concept. But there's also restorative justice. And restorative justice is bigger than the individual. It's really the community. And so when you read about and think about restorative justice from an ancient Hebrew kind of perspective, what you mean by that, or what the Scriptures, I think, mean by that, is this attempt to change society, to change systems that you're in, to change kind of social structures that are unjust.
Right.
Because as human beings, as flawed individuals, what happens is we get into communities and we start treating one another in not just kind of filled ways. And so this restorative justice is more of this big concept of attempting to create a better society, and to address societal issues that are unjust.
Right.
And we'll probably lean more towards that type of justice as we continue our conversation.
And what I want to highlight is that, so like you said, through the scripture, the path to justice in that sense, in the Old Testament, the path is hard.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
And we constantly mess it up.
Exactly. And I feel like that can be applied to today so strongly because it's hard. We're always changing, trying to do better, trying to do different things as a society and trying to fix wrongdoings or unjustness. So
for First Christian, at least for me and how I think about it theologically, there's a key belief within how we understand just God and the world theologically that drives our justice seeking. Beyond that, God commands us to do it. Right. In the scriptures, God commands us as God's people to seek justice.
And that's very important to our denomination.
Right. Yeah, justice is very important to our denomination, and we'll get to that later. But so for me, the theological belief that most impacts my understanding of God's command to seek justice is this notion that at creation, humanity is created in the image of God. So if you think back to the creation story in Genesis, Adam and Eve, we're told, are created in God's own image. And I read that as kind of metaphorically to mean that all of humanity is created in the image of God. So there's a part of God in you, a part of God in me, a part of God in each of our viewers or listeners. And what that means is that we're all children of God, and we're all beloved by God and part of God's beloved community. And then the way that belief, that theological belief, fits in with justice, if God exists in each of us, if we're each made in the image of God, we should seek to allow each individual to be treated in a manner that reflects God within them. And so that, for me, that's how we get to kind of this justice orientation through our belief system. There's two quotes I want to highlight before we get into our folks from the newsletter and from our church. The first is from John Dominic Crossan. Crossan is a Bible scholar that I really admire. And he made a comment once that in the Hebrew Bible, meaning the Old Testament, God says to the people, "I reject your worship because of your lack of justice." Not, "I reject your justice because of your lack of worship," right? And I think he didn't quote where he was talking about, but I believe he was talking from the prophet Amos, chapter 5, talks about God rejecting Israel's worship because of their lack of justice. And what Crossan means by that is justice is so fundamental to who we are called to be by God that if we do not do it, God will reject our praise and adoration, our worship over God. That's how important it is for God's people. And then the second quote I want to bring up is George MacDonald. George MacDonald is he's passed now, an old minister. And in a sermon that I read of his, he says that, "I believe that justice and mercy are simply one and the same thing. Without justice to the full, there can be no mercy. And without mercy to the full, there can be no justice." So MacDonald is talking about this concept that to live in a merciful manner that Christ calls us to be, we must be just. We must create these kind of just systems. So that's where kind of I am with justice and how we get to justice. So I'd like to take a minute and read. We had 2 responses from church members in our newsletter, and then we got a third one after the newsletter printed. So I want to read those 3, and then we'll dive in kind of to more detail. So the first one we have is from Zach Womack. Zach is a local lawyer here in town. That's important to highlight because you can hear that and read that in his writing. In fact, one of the things we talked about last time in our podcast was how individual the responses were and how we could highlight kind of the person's personality
from how they
answer it. So I think you see that with Zach. So this is Zach. So he kind of gives us a definition of social justice. Our question was, how do you respond to God's commandment to seek social justice? Yes. And I think that was a difficult question for some of our folks to answer.
I think it is a difficult question in general. And when not a lot of people could define it off the top of their head, I feel like.
Right.
Not a lot of people could define it in the way that it's meant to be defined as.
Well, and let's highlight too, especially in our culture right now with all of the divisiveness that's happening with COVID, with everything kind of going on, social justice issues have become really hot button topics, really political, right? So it's really hard to have deep and meaningful conversations with these because they're so ingrained into our political affiliations, into our religious affiliations, right? So, and
even a lot of hate is behind that as well too.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's hard to kind of cut through all that. So, all right, here's Zach's response to that question. Social justice, he gives a definition of it, is an ideological concept relating to the proposition of fundamental fairness throughout society. The concept takes on great meaning and crosses many social boundaries, including but not limited to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, privileges, immunities, employment, housing, work, etc. It is generally recognized as a principle that enables equal access, equity, participation, and general overall human rights within society. He continues, with respect to God's commandment to seek social justice, First Christian Church has, according to its mission statement, as well as its own history, dedicated itself to not only opposing social injustices, which are discriminatory, but also addressing inequalities that may arise from unfair treatment related to ignorance, poverty, racism, war, etc. First Christian Church's concept of social injustice applies to all of God's children, and the church makes every effort to present itself in a like manner consistent with the concept of social justice. All of the church members take active roles or are permitted to take active roles within the church functions. These efforts are better reflected by the church's activities within the community, seeking equal and equitable rights and treatment for all. So that was Zach's response. Debbie Inyard, one of our elders, responded in this way. Since I've grown in my faith, it has enabled me to become more aware of the inequalities within our community. I have witnessed firsthand, working within Christian community outreach, of the struggles that people right here in our hometown face, including injustices related to finances, food security, healthcare, and basic human rights. I've come to the realization that in order to recognize the inequalities within our justice system, I have to not only take a step back from my own privileges, but I also have to be strong within my faith and turn to prayer. God has taught me to see people based on their character rather than their physical appearance. It is important to remember during these troublesome times that we must turn to our faith and our trust in God. So that's Debbie's response. And then Cindy Evans is also one of our elders. She responded in this way. Jesus told his followers that if they gave food to a hungry person, drink to one who was thirsty, clothes to one who was naked, or if they visited one who was sick or in prison, they did these things to him. Today we see so much need in the world. Through the radio, TV, or the internet, we can feel overwhelmed by the amount of need. Jesus' words remind us that if we can't solve all problems, we can still solve some. So men from our church help build Habitat homes. Our CWF, Christian Womenship Fellowship, sponsors a giveaway of clothing. Students fill Christmas boxes at Christmas time to send overseas. Wednesday morning workers deliver food to Red Banks. And people throughout the church visit and pray for the sick and the hurting. There are always pain and grief in the world, but Jesus' words remind us that we can each do something to alleviate that pain.
Right.
So that's Cindy's response.
I took a few notes during that, and what I wanted to highlight, unless you have something to add before we start, is that each individual that responded to our question is talking about how they're being more educated or are kind of realizing a lot more about this topic through their volunteering, through their worship, through their prayer and faith. So really, they're using church as a way to, I want to say, they're using this as a way, they're without knowing it, as to educate themselves more so. Like, this is teaching them how more, it's like broadening their view, showing them different things that, like, whose response was it? Debbie's. She said that, like, through that, she realized a lot about the world. Like, through volunteering, through this, she realized that there was a lot of need.
Yeah,
So,
one of the things we do as a church is encourage our individual members to get connected, involved, in outreach programs that are happening in the city.
Right.
We're a small church, right? And one of the downsides of being a small church is we can't do a lot of big outreach programs on our own. We do some, right? Cindy mentioned a number of them in her response. But what we can do is encourage our church members to get involved in outreach programs like Christian Community Outreach, Habitat for Humanity. There's a lot of really good kind of outreach programming happening in Henderson,
right,
within the city itself, and our members are involved in a lot of those. The New Boys and Girls Club, we have a lot of church members involved in that, and our encouragement is to be involved in that because, one, God commands us to seek justice in the world.
Seek that out,
and we think that's a big part. But two, it's also a piece of your own personal kind of discipleship process, right? And that's the process by which you become more like Christ, right? Christ invites us to be and grow in our faith, to be more like Him. And so one of the ways that you can be more like Christ is to work towards justice and to work toward alleviating the injustices in the world and caring for the people who are hurting, those on kind of the edges and the margins of society. And I think a lot of our church members realize that as they do that, they're growing in their own faith. They're learning more about the world, about Christ, about themselves.
And I take that in a way too, because whenever COVID started, church shut down. Right. Nobody had church. That was a big thing that was happening for us, and we had to find ways. You came to me and we found ways to live stream, and I volunteered and stuff like that. And like, volunteering showed me a whole new side to church. Like, before that, I didn't necessarily go to church. So as I stepped into having routine, like a worship routine, and worshiping and coming to church, I found a whole bunch of different things. I didn't know how involved as a church we were until then.
That ties into our conversation last month, right, on spiritual practices. And we didn't mention it, but working and volunteering and seeking justice and doing kind of humanitarian aid, if you want to call it that, on even a small scale, can be and is a spiritual practice. It helps you grow in your faith.
Yeah, that's true. So I found that very interesting that it all kind of connects together.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
What else? Something that jumped out at me from Cindy's, she talked about kind of this overwhelming feeling, of trying to, being overwhelmed by the injustices of the world. And I think a lot of people feel like, man, there's so much wrong. How can I fix
that?
Yeah.
Or
how can I do
they could
anything?
take it another way and just ignore it.
Yeah.
Because it is so overwhelming.
Right.
So
I think Cindy talks about, we can't really change the whole world. No one person can do that. Now, if you get enough people together, you have more momentum.
Right.
And that's true. No one person can change the whole world, but one person can change another person's whole world. Right?
Exactly.
So if you don't think of it as this huge kind of global, right? One of the benefits of the society and kind of culture we live in now is that we're so connected through the internet and through news media and through social media. I mean, I can be connected to someone halfway around the world or all the way around the world, right? That I may never meet in person. I'm able to be connected with in a way that I've never been able to be before in history. Now, the downside to that is we see all the terrible things in the world as well, right? There's good and bad that come with that. And that can be overwhelming. And it can lead us to feel like we can't do anything, or it can even lead us to want to block it out because it's too overwhelming to deal with.
Yes.
But I would challenge our listeners, those people watching, you can change the world for someone.
Exactly.
Right? And in fact, you're called by God to do it. Like, God is challenging you to do that and to attempt to make the world a better place for that.
And that can even start with just brightening someone's day or doing something small. Like, not all of this is going to be huge, ginormous things, like you said. Like, you, as an individual, helping someone just even with small acts is going to brighten someone's day entirely.
Yeah, there's a great quote I heard recently that says, justice is making other people's problems my problems. Right? Kind of having the empathy to take on the injustices in the world that may not affect you personally, but in taking those things on, you then have a heart and a desire to want to fix that or deal with it or find answers to it.
And in many ways, it's also like just being there and listening to a person, or hearing them out, or hearing their side and their point of view.
Well, and as we mentioned, a lot of social justice kind of work right now is really hot topic issues. Right? I think about kind of Black Lives Matter movement or the LGBTQ movement, kind of wanting equality for these different people. And that's really political and really hard conversations to have. And so I would add that in doing the work of justice, especially from a religious perspective or from a faith perspective, it has to be kind of housed in prayer and in devotion and in our worship. I think Debbie talks about that in her response, right? Is this need to be strong in your faith, to have a strong understanding of your own personal relationship with Christ and with God, and having a strong prayer life, so that when this stuff gets hard, because it will, and it is hard, you have that kind of foundation to move to. So as far as spiritual discipline stuff goes, I would say justice and seeking social justice probably isn't your introduction into faith. Although for some people it is.
That's true.
It is. But for most folks, especially folks with privilege, like Jada and I, we don't jump into it necessarily head first. But as we build a strong foundation with our faith, and as we learn more, as we grow in our faith, as we grow in our understanding, as we grow in our theology, we have the foundation then to take those steps.
And it's very scary for some people. It is like, because you don't want to come across as with hate, or to be ignorant to your privilege, or to kind of, you don't want to hurt an individual or a group of, you know what I'm saying, like stuff like that. So it's very scary, and it's not just, you have to realize that it's not just you and you're not alone, and that you have to seek it through Christ to be strong and try and understand every side. And
one of the things I try to tell, we're a predominantly upper class white church, for the most part. There's diversity in that, but one of the things I try to help our parishioners with, or folks who are kind of struggling with this, is that the justice seeking that is happening in the world is not personal, right? I think a lot of, especially privileged people, it's true for me as a white person, when I kind of head up against and rub up against my own privilege, it almost feels personal, right? When it gets called out, or when you kind of hit it and go, oh, well, that didn't feel good, right? Or that was hateful, or that leads to, that was racist, or that was, whatever. It feels really personal, and there's a lot of guilt and shame that comes with that. Some of that's cultural for the country we live in, and for our own sin of racism and slavery that, we're still trying to deal with. What I try to remember for myself, and what I try my best with my own parishioners when we have these conversations to get across, is a lot of the justice work that's happening in our culture right now is not really on the personal level, right? We're not personally attacking anyone. It's a societal issue, right? The system is broken. The the structure, the societal structure is what's broken, and we're as a culture, we're trying to address that thing. Now that's hard for those of us that have benefited from this structure for so long,
true.
right?
That's true.
That's what's hard.
Yeah.
And it can feel personal. That's true. But none of these things are a personal attack on any one person. It's an attack on the system and the structure itself. And there's a lot of biblical understandings for that. All the prophets throughout our scriptures were doing that same thing. They were trying to address the structural issues within the nation or the people of Israel that weren't following the path they believed God had called Israel to be on. And we see throughout time and time again throughout the scriptures, we see the consequences of those actions, and we see prophets coming attempting to address that. I think we even see that with Jesus himself.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. I agree. So you were going to talk a little bit about our denomination. Yeah,
there's two main things I want to mention. The way our denomination works, each local church has its own autonomy, kind of creates its own rules and whatever, and we live in covenant together. We use that biblical theme of covenant for how we manage our denomination. It's one of those weird situations because of our focus on the individual, right?
Right.
And because of that focus, it's hard to structure, right? Because we want each individual to have their own freedom of their own beliefs, right? And so on a national and international kind of basis, the denomination has really struggled throughout our history to figure out what does it mean to even be denominational? Does that even make sense for how we understand ourselves? Our founders and at the beginning of what would become this denomination really wanted to highlight that God works through local congregations, right? The local congregations know the community best. They build themselves up in kind of like manners with one another. And so the way God works in the world is through the local congregation. And so it's always been a struggle for our denomination on how you structure as you get bigger. Yeah. And we still struggle with that even to this day.
Alrighty, we had some technical difficulties again. It seems like it's doing it to us every week now. I don't know. But as we close, we are going to talk about some social justice issues in our denomination.
Yeah, really highlight those. The ways our denomination as a whole is addressing some justice issues. And I'll highlight, it's a little difficult for us as a denomination because we value so much the individual freedom of individual members, but also of individual congregations. Right? So the way our denomination works, the national organization, the regional levels, usually broken up by state, don't tell the individual churches kind of what to do or what to believe. And that's a little bit of a struggle denominationally for us, and always has been, because we so much value the individual congregation's local autonomy, that it makes gathering and connecting on a national level difficult because one congregation here can believe radically different from another congregation.
And then even the congregations, the people in those.
There's diversity and differences of opinions within that. So
it seems like it'd be
it's a little
challenging.
It's one of the challenges of our particular belief system, but we so value the individual and local autonomy of the congregation that we just deal with it.
Right.
And not to dive too much into that, maybe we can do a denominational polity podcast sometime in the future because that seems to bore people. But I do want to highlight as a denomination what we're doing nationally and even globally. The first thing I want to highlight is that in 2001, our General Assembly, that's kind of the denominational governing body made up of delegates from all congregations, ministers. It's a huge kind of gathering for worship and fellowship and to make decisions on behalf of the denomination. One of the things they did in 2001 was adopt what we call the 2020 vision. It was a goal to highlight 4 priorities between 2001 and the year 2020. And one of those 4 priorities was to become a pro-reconciling, anti-racist church. not just to name that racism is bad. As a congregation and as a denomination, we believe racism is a sin and does not honor the individual image of God in each person.
Right.
And so we're, as a denomination, we're working towards attempting to become pro-reconciling and actually anti-racist, not just to name racism as bad, but to work against it.
Exactly.
One of the ways we're doing that is that pro-reconciliation and anti-racism training is now required as continuing education for most of our clergy. I know as an ordained clergy person in the denomination in the state of Kentucky, it's a requirement every 5 years. I have to take that training along with my Healthy Boundaries training. So that's one of the ways all of our ministers are trained in what it could look like to be anti-racist, and what it might look like to become more pro-reconciling in how we treat one another. The general board of our denomination is also accountable to all the various demographics of our nation. They have to, by our denominational bylaws, have 30% of the members of the general board have to be people of color. So that's one of the steps we took. And then they also did, throughout our government documents, our governing documents as a denomination, they had a special group come in and do what they called was a racism audit, just to make sure there was no language of racism or inherent kind of structural issues in our denomination that may hint at racism or may be unfairly set up against people of color. We did all that, not to create conflict or to claim that anybody in our denomination is racist. We did that because we recognize that historically, a lot of white churches kept people of color actually out of their membership for a long time in this country. Right. Our denomination was founded almost around the same time that our country was founded. Obviously, racism was a big thing then. People had slaves and treated one another very differently because of the color of their skin, and that was true in the church as well. And while that may not be the case now, we recognize as a denomination that our structure was set up in a time when that was the case. Right. And so we just want to make sure we're dealing with the sin of racism, even within our own structure, in the best way we can. So there's a special ministry within our church called Reconciliation Ministry that is really helping us figure all of that out. Reconciliation Ministry was founded upon this need and desire we have as a denomination to make visible all of God's beloved community. So to really highlight that every individual is made in the image of God and has a contribution to the ministry of the church, and so we need them in our church with us. So so that's the pro-reconciling anti-racism part of our church. The other thing I wanted to highlight was Week of Compassion. Week of Compassion is a ministry within our general church who is really attempting to reach the needs of the world. And so Week of Compassion was founded during World War II, kind of as these humanitarian crises these across the world were kind of becoming to fruition, and we started noticing them more on this global scale. Week of Compassion does three things primarily. They do disaster relief. So anytime there's a national disaster, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, any of that, either domestic here in the States, or globally, Week of Compassion is responding to that with humanitarian aid, with funding, with whatever we can, partnering with Red Cross and all the other organizations to address some of that. That's primarily what I think many of us think of when we think of Week of Compassion. Anytime there's a huge kind of disaster, you may see in many disciples churches, they point to ways you can donate to Week of Compassion's fund for that particular crisis. But they also serve as kind of logistics and financial funding for refugee relocation. So people who are having to flee their homes due to war or some kind of issue, Week of Compassion is helping with that on a global scale. And then the third piece of what Week of Compassion does that I really wasn't aware of until I got more involved in the denomination was their sustainable development. So they recognize that one of the ways to help with disaster response isn't just sending aid or funds, but it's really going into communities and helping to build up the systems that are there in that community.
Right.
And so there's a sustainable development model in Week of Compassion that is working really hard in places where we've had kind of mission work or ministry work as a denomination, that they're working to really develop within that community new businesses, sustainable kind of models of better housing, and it's really an address to poverty around the world. There's a lot of really, really cool stories about the sustainable development that Week of Compassion is doing. So we'll link Week of Compassion's website to this, and you can check those out if you want. And Week of Compassion uses the 17 sustainable development goals as set by the United Nations and how they go about doing that work. One of the things that's really interesting, I think, is to see the ways that kind of mission work has changed over time as we've learned about what actually is best practices and ways to help communities.
Exactly. Yes.
And so that's a lot of what we're doing. So,
and I think it's very interesting, like seeing it all on a larger scale. Like before I started getting more involved, we do Week of Compassion here at our church, and not a lot, like before I got involved, I didn't know a lot about it. And just seeing where that goes and how our denomination is really taking the steps and kind of like recognizing the problems in the society and even within themselves in the past.
Right.
You know what I mean? And taking responsibility and basically just making sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
Taking those good steps and responding to that in such a great way.
Yeah, you mentioned we do Week of Compassion. Just for our listeners and our viewers, I would highlight that the reason it's named Week of Compassion and the way churches contribute to Week of Compassion in our denomination is usually what we do 1 week out of the year. We take up monetary donations for Week of Compassion ministry. And so that's how churches kind of fund that arm and the mission work of our denomination. And it's all funded through our local congregations, right? The local congregation is the driving force of God's work in the world. And so we recognize that there's some things we can't do as an individual congregation in the world, but if we pool our resources together, we can do that as a universal church. So.
Right. So I just think it's interesting, as you said, and
it gets to that conversation we were having earlier about the struggle, right? The problems are so big.
Right.
As one individual, as one congregation, it feels like we can't do much about it. But if we can gather resources together and find a vision for how we want to address some of these things, we can work towards them.
Exactly. So. Yes. So. Other than that, do we have anything else that we need to discuss today?
I think that's it. I've talked a lot anyway. So.
Right. Yes, I haven't talked as much this week, but I didn't know a lot about it other than, and like, I will mention that doing the research for this podcast was very interesting for us because we both learned a lot in that process, and it was super.
Yeah, and I would say if you're interested in doing more justice work, to reach out to us or to get more involved in the life of the church, let us know, because I do believe God is calling us as people of faith to address these things in the best way we can.
Right.
And because of our value of individual kind of belief systems, we really want a diversity of ideas and thoughts about some of these ideas. You know, the conversations can be hard sometimes, but that's the challenge of being the church God's calling us to be. We want every opinion and every thought, and that's important. So we got to get all those things on the table before we can put together the best kind of response. So.
That's true. So if you have not already, be sure to subscribe, and let us know in the comments or however you are watching this. We post it on Facebook too, so feel free to comment or message us and let us know if you have any ideas for the podcast or have something you wish to reach out to us about. Me and David are constantly checking that, so we will get and respond to you.
Yeah, I would add, we're doing this kind of response to question thing in the newsletter right now for the church, but at some point that'll shift.
Exactly, yes.
But we want to continue the podcast. So we need to know what topics you would be interested in us talking about, or what else we can do. So. And
no idea is a bad idea. We've learned that. Right. We've learned that. There are many ways to contact us. You can find most of those already linked on our YouTube, but there are many ways to contact us. They're all virtually under FCC Henderson or First Christian Church.
Research FCC Henderson. You usually find us.
You'll find us.
We're on Facebook, somewhere. Instagram, YouTube.
All the works.
That's right.
So I believe that is it for today. But thank you for joining us, and be sure to tune in next time.
Awesome. Thank you, Jada.